Okay. Hello, I'm Peggy Liu, and I'm with my good friend Gary Rieschel, who is in this beautiful, beautiful paradise, which we're not going to show you today, but he's in Montana, and he spent a lot of his life in Asia. So I'm really, really honored to be able to seek his old man's wisdom
Man,
for
old wisdom.
how to deal with COVID, and then what he sees in the future because he's seen so much. So first, I'm just going to set the context, Gary, if I can.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time in Asia? And then you're obviously you're an American, but maybe you can give us some of your background of your travels.
So I had spent 5 years in Japan from '88 to '93, and then moved to China in 2005 and spent 12 years in Shanghai. In neither case, well, when I moved to Japan, it was really for business. But the two things that came out of being in Japan was we're meeting two people that wound up having a big impact on my life. One was my wife, Yuka, in 1989, and the second was a gentleman named Masayoshi Son, who's the head of SoftBank. And I met him at a driving range in Tokyo in 1989. And so those two folks, not related to the business I had in Japan, wound up having a huge impact on my life. And then in 2005, I had run SoftBank's venture group for 10 years and retired. And we moved to China. So our kids, because my wife Yuka's from Hong Kong, so we wanted to have want the kids to have the experience of being in China a little bit. So we moved to Shanghai, and we were going to be there for 6 months, and we wound up staying for 12 years because there was a chance, there was just an opportunity to put together a firm called Qiming, Venture Partners, with my partner Dwayne Kwong, and so we launched that in November 2005.
And then now, where are you?
And then in 2016, decided to move back to the U.S. So moved to Seattle, and so the last 4 years we've been living in Seattle.
So basically, Gary is a big shot. He's been all over the world, invested all over the world, many, 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 many successful investments, and he really has a broad view of many industries and sort of global geopolitics. So I'm going to try and tap in to that wisdom, and then also ask him for advice for the future generation. So maybe I'll start there, which is, what would you tell your 24-year-old self?
The things that worked for me when I look back was I was willing to put myself into situations that other people were not. Meaning in the 1980s, very few Americans were looking to go to Japan. It was a very difficult place to work. It was complicated. Japan was very competitive. You had language issues, cultural issues. And doing that, and then also going to China. I'm the only senior VC from Silicon Valley that ever spent meaningful time in China. Others went for 9 or 12 months, but no one else really committed, more than a decade to be there. So that part worked. The ability to put yourself into a situation where you're not like everyone else. And there are two things about that. Number one, you have to be comfortable not being like everyone else, because most of the time, consciously or unconsciously, we actually try to fit in. And so if you are putting yourself into a situation where every day you're not going to understand everything going on around you, you're going to have a lot of comments made about you, you're not going to necessarily fully comprehend. To be able to do that requires a certain personality. But if you can do that, the rewards, I think personally, are really quite substantial.
Wait, does that Gary, in order to do this? Oh boy.
Sorry, what?
Does that mean everybody has to be your personality? If so, oh boy.
No, you can do this. You can do this in small ways. So the idea of learning to communicate with people that are not like you, you can do that in everyday life. It's a trait that right now the social media, the socialization of the internet has caused people to kind of retreat to their own camps. So it means reaching out and consciously talking to people that don't think like you, without having a emotional reaction such that you don't really know how to listen. So it was a good skill for me. I needed it to be a little more dramatic, I think, than others, because that's just my personality. But I liked the idea that it caused me to learn to think, and to learn to really, when you're in another culture, to appreciate that, okay, there's something here to learn. I may not agree with all of it, but the open-mindedness of that, I think, was very powerful for me.
Okay, so actually, can you give me a very specific example? Because I think what you just tapped into is what the whole world needs in order for us not to separate even further into tribal bubbles. So do you have an individual story about somebody who you really maybe triggered you even? And then how do
Uh,
you do that?
yeah, so in 1990,
Somebody else.
what's that?
Not me, not a story about me, somebody else.
Oh, don't worry. I'm not. I wasn't really going there, Peggy. But there
Kidding.
was a gentleman named Dr. Mizuno who was the head of R&D for Matsushita Panasonic. So in 1990, he called me and said, "I want you to come down to Tokyo, to Kyoto. I want to have dinner. I have something very important to tell you." So I'm thinking on the train on the way down, how many hundred things I've done wrong in the first year I was in Japan, and what he wants to talk to me about. And we sit down, we have dinner, we're having a little sake. He looks at me and goes, "This is very important, Gary-san. Don't try to be Japanese. We're better at it than you are." And that has always stuck with me, because what his point was it was a right to be appreciative of the culture and try to learn the language and try to absorb some elements of that. But I was there to be the best American business person representing a joint venture that they had. I wasn't there to be one of them. And so what I have found is it was a real reminder to be really true to who you are. Don't, the one thing you can never really get confused about, you can fake it sometimes, but you should never be confused as to who you are. And so back in Japan in 1990, that was a very powerful lesson that actually helped me immensely when I've moved anywhere else, or in most of the business dealings I've had. Always knowing who you are in that situation is very valuable.
So be your authentic self. That's the most important thing.
Right. We all want to fool each other, fool ourselves some of the time, but there are moments in life where you really need to remember who you are, who you truly are, and it's good to be able to go back to that.
Gary, I think you need a little book, like one of those little tiny books at the cashiers at the bookstores. Gary. Okay, so
yeah, it'll be a very short book.
Well, that's all people have attention span for anyway. So actually, let me push this a little bit further, because as you know, I travel around the world and I try to explain China. I try to be this little window into China, and so do you in your work. So what is something that you would tell the rest of the world, meaning the West mainly, about China today that would help bring people together?
So one of the things that, if you ask me to talk about, how to explain China to the West, you have to realize that China is very complicated. And so if you compare it with Japan, Japan had about a dozen windows that I would use to explain Japan to Americans. China has about 50. So what you have is a much more complicated set of descriptions. Are you talking about the regions in China? Are you talking about the party? Are you talking about the different ethnicities in China? And so you have to realize that when you look at China and you're explaining China to someone, please don't say you're an expert, because there really are no experts on China. There are no experts on America. We all understand pieces of China or pieces of America very, very well. But also when you're explaining through that window, by definition, you're accepting a frame that's somewhat limited. And you need to explain to folks, this is not the whole story. But we're in a situation now where there's so many broad characterizations around China is this, America is that, back and forth. And those are really not productive conversations. I think it's incredibly important to understand the nuance, trying to appreciate the nuances of understanding China. It takes people decades to understand one part. And I think that the broad generalizations are doing all of us a great disservice.
One of the things that I tell people is, rather than complain about what's wrong and blame people, try to envision the world that you want to be. So if I could ask you to envision the world where China and the US are getting along swimmingly and collaboratively, and they're creating together, what does that world actually look like?
So I think that the US, as China has become more and more confident and also capable in the area that I work in with entrepreneurs. We work with entrepreneurs because they're the ones who solve problems. And China's group over the last 20 years of entrepreneurs has truly become world class. So there's really no, it in the United States really are the source of much of the entrepreneurial energy and innovation on the planet. China will not be like the U.S. The U.S. will not be like China. So I don't expect the countries to be the same. What I expect is collaboration, which the scientists work together to solve problems that are beyond the borders of either the US or China. And I'd like to see coordination so that those two things work together. Right now in the US on the COVID response, we have a great deal of collaboration. We don't have a lot of coordination. And I think both are required for the two countries to interact, knowing full well you're going to start a lot of meetings saying, I know we're going to disagree on this, but the impact of this is something further downstream that we should have a conversation about whether that's something that we want. I would wish that the U.S. would have a, how do I say this? It would have a strategy that would last longer than a CNN news clip. I wish China would be more transparent. I think the transparency, is not going to suit either the party or the country or the citizens of China long term. And in the U.S., the constant bickering and going back and forth and really losing sight of what the large issues are for the society are also not going to help any aspect of the country as it goes forward.
So you were part of the launch of joint US-China collaboration on clean energy with me and advised us for years. That's, to me, a very specific example of trying to do programmatic collaboration. Can you picture, for example, maybe in the supply chain, what does collaboration, mutual beneficial collaboration look like between US and China?
Well, on the COVID crisis, which is a good example, there's a great deal of knowledge in China. There are vaccine companies, there are nine Qiming companies now between the US and China actively working on different aspects of the COVID crisis. What you see is a reluctance in the US government to actually engage with the Chinese firms that are doing some really world-class work in that regard. You see a reluctance in China to really allow their researchers to interact with the foreign experts. And so that's a really good example where we don't really have the collaboration that I think would allow us to bring forward vaccines and therapies into the market, potentially 6 months sooner. That could be the difference. That could be 50,000 lives, could be 100,000 lives, could be the difference between having the next 2 years be relatively catastrophic for millions of small businesses in both countries or around the world. So that kind of collaboration on the research side, we should not seek to politicize that in every case. And I think that that's something that both systems right now are really struggling with. On coordination, when you look at the PPE issues and sourcing, that could have been handled in a much more organized way, certainly on the US side, in terms of having coordination of sourcing and coordination of buying and prioritization across the states. And the decision was made to not use the federal government resources necessarily to do that. China could have been much more transparent in terms of the sources of supply it had available, what the production capacity was going to be, how it was allocating that to its different customers. So again, I think those are examples where in a time of a crisis, we've always thought that everyone would drop the politics and come together and actually work more efficiently together. And that didn't necessarily happen this time.
So Gary, I'm going to push you a little bit because the way that you answered that question was what is wrong now. What I want to envision is if you were in charge, which would be awesome, what would that actually look like? Come on, Gary, run for office. What would that actually look like in terms of people and committees and knowing what you know about how China works and how America works? Like, what does that actually look like? Because in my belief system, if you can envision it, if you can imagine it, you can make it happen. But if you're only thinking about what's wrong, it's very difficult to then make the world that you want actually happen. So I'm going to push you a little bit, talk in that frame.
Yeah, that's a good push. So the when you look at the CDC or you look at WHO, we should not be having debates as to political issues around that. We should have CDC. China should welcome the CDC in. China should, the US should not be divorcing the financing or separating the financing of WHO. So you would abstract away from the political framework certain key things, dealing with pandemics, because it's quite selfish in one way to think about it, just from the US perspective. Dealing with this the right way saves tens of millions of lives around the world. And as you go forward, and it's very self-serving in one sense, because as you start to go to globalization 2.0, we've had a bipolar globalization. The US and China have benefited disproportionately, both have benefited disproportionately from that. You're going to see this distributed more in the future. People will keep supply chains in China, but that's mostly going to be for the Chinese market. People will start to distribute into Central, South America, Southeast Asia, Africa. You'll start to distribute those supply chains. You're taking on a responsibility that you also need to think about, well, if a pandemic therefore affects Africa and the lack of healthcare services that they have, you need to plan for that. You need to actually be actively engaged. Any one of those issues is too big for the US or China to do by themselves.
Okay, but
and so
what
you'd
does
like
that
to
look like, Gary? What does that look like? What does the organization look like on both sides? Is it another multilateral organization?
so imagine Scalloway has talked about a Corona Corps, like the Peace Corps, but for the picking up the pieces after the coronavirus. You could imagine that being something that would have funding equally between the US and China, and would have citizens, students, volunteers from the US and China. You could imagine an entire discussion around, again, both sides have to improve their transparency. We can't abstract away the government decision-making process, however much I would like to sometimes. So I think you start with the academic institutions, you start with the research institutions, you start with the corporations. The governments are not going to be the leaders on this. It's going to be up to us, it's going to be up to entrepreneurs to create forums and to create standard body discussions where we can collaborate. I do not wish for or even imagine that the US and Chinese governments are going to start to see eye to eye anytime in the near future. But to your point, it's not an excuse for doing nothing. So we should encourage the entrepreneurs we invest in to be open-minded and to think about how you could work with your counterparts in China, especially on healthcare. I think that's an area both countries have a great deal to gain by working together. But I think you have to be pragmatic and say, it's going to start, please don't, Tom Cotton and the guys saying, let's not have Chinese students come to the United States. That's a relatively brain dead set of comments. So let's make sure that we can have those one-on-one interactions at the student level, the academic level, the research level, and then you build off of that and you go up the chain. This will not come from a top-down, we've suddenly seen the light, we need to collaborate with the United States or we need to collaborate with China. That's just not going to happen. And so I look at it, rely upon the entrepreneurs. The last 25 years of my life, anything that's worked out for me has been depending upon entrepreneurs to solve problems. And that's what I would push for. And that's what we spend a great deal of our time on now, are those types of initiatives.
So I'm going to push you again one level above, because just yesterday I was speaking to a group of Greek shipping, magnates, CEOs, that represent 20% of all shipping cargo around the world. And I made the point also that our youth should come together and interact, but then they were like, well, there's this problem because the youth in China are on WeChat, they speak Chinese, so there's a lot of barriers. So practically speaking, how would we get American children or entrepreneurs to really interact and engage, especially now that you wouldn't just hop on a plane and go to China or the US? So practically.
So I think that, again, you start to facilitate the people that can interact to interact. So there's hundreds of thousands of Americans that speak Chinese, maybe millions, but not, not tens of millions. A lot of the younger Chinese would be able to speak. A lot of the researchers in most areas have some pretty, facile language capability, so they'd be able to interact. Entrepreneurs, again, you would pick ones that can interact. I mean, this isn't about creating a language school for entrepreneurs, and so I think the majority of the entrepreneurs that we interact with on healthcare have had experience in both countries, and or certainly have people on their staff that have experience in both countries. So again, I think it's a lot, making sure that the people that do choose to interact and want to interact are not punished. So institutions that have Chinese researchers on their staff are not suddenly put under constant FBI surveillance, or you have to be very clear about the rules. On the Chinese government side, please be a little more open to foreign. Don't set up barriers to foreign students, coming to China to learn Chinese. So the governments can play a role in facilitating this, but I don't think we need to worry about having everyone be capable of participating in this at the beginning. I think you can cherry pick and select the folks that have those abilities. And as that works, you're going to see people say, oh, well, I want to do that. Look at venture capital in China. $1 billion was available in 2005. Today, tens and tens of billions of dollars. And it was because it was successful. But it started with a very small number of entrepreneurs and not generally very complete teams. And over time, people said, well, I'm going to leave this company to start. I can do this. I can leave a company to start another business. And then pretty soon, entire teams were capable of doing that. Some of this takes time, but there's no excuse for not having that kind of interact and exchange, if you will.
So are you familiar with, I think it was under Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, I think it was something called 100,000 something. Yes. So what went wrong there? Why did that not become the vision that you're talking about?
So part of it was simply the financing, of it. It started as it started with a smaller number and then grew into, it became something called a million strong, USChina million strong. I was actually on the board of that institution. And what wound up happening is, without the government eliminating barriers for that on both sides, making visas more accessible and really, really facilitating it. This was kind of launched during the, Hank Paulson, Hillary Clinton, period of time with strategic dialogues and things like that. Once those fell apart and those ceased, there was really no momentum that had been built up, because it did take money to actually conduct these programs. And so once the government, that's why I keep looking back to the entrepreneurial side, because it's private money, it's private individuals that are looking at what they need to do. Look at what Joe Tsai and Jack Ma and those folks did for, providing PPE to the United States over the course of the last few months. It's the initiative of those private, enterprises that I would count on. The 100,000 strong program was too dependent on the government.
If there was a Gary Rieschel program, how would that get started? What's the beginning, and then how do you scale that?
So the current Gary Rieschel program are people that I've worked with over the last 10 or 15 years, and we get them together, try to get them together once a year. I try to see all of them at least once a year, and about what they and what all the other people we support are doing. So to me, it's about making those folks aware of each other and how they might interact with each other. And what I've generally found is, once they're introduced and they start to spend time with each other, things run off in all sorts of directions I wouldn't have expected. We're now launching, we just funded a mental health facility in Bozeman that will wind up expand. It's a totally virtual counseling and mental health facility, because I think coming out of this crisis, we're going to have unprecedented waves of mental health disease. And so finding a young entrepreneur who has a great, strong background in that, and then I introduce her to 4 or 5 other people in my universe. And so then that's all it took. And then she gets this thing funded and she takes off. So I think that's how we do it. Some of our friends are really, really good at doing things one person at a time. You know, they find someone they care about and they will just they will rescue one person at a time. And I have to say, I admire them greatly, and it's just not my personality. So I always think about, you know, someone like you, Peggy, when we talk, you reach out, you touch, you know, 1,000 people, 10,000 people. I try to find those leverage points, because those are all things way beyond my own personal ability to
Yeah, I call it acupressure points.
do. Acu influence points.
For people who are in COVID situation and really in dire straits, and they're looking at the future hopelessly, what are the opportunities coming out of COVID that the masses can look towards?
So I think what you're going to find, three very easy big trends that a lot of people have been talking. We've been talking about this now for about 3 months. So telehealth, I think, will wind up replacing a lot of a great number of doctors' visits. Qiming just funded a company that has the largest, will be the largest telehealth nursing facility for at-home care. And then when they need to, they have to go out and go to that. We just talked about this mental health disease, kind of virtualization of that process. So everything associated with telehealth. And these are the things I'm talking about, are things that are never going to go back to the way they were. So online education, yeah, the university system will never go back in the way it was. And I think that those are, when you look at that initially, the initial wave of this will be terribly dislocative. You're going to have tens of thousands of very low income workers that they're suddenly not going to be having to clean buildings, not having to do some of the basic support functions, basic administration functions in these institutions. And that's going to be a very, very serious hit. And then the third is working from home. So working from home winds up being maybe the biggest of these trends, and the one that is happening most quickly. So I always was looking at the automation and the job dislocations occurring over the next 10 or 20, 30 years, and concerned that the transition was going to be bad. That yes, all of the technologies that you and I and others have spent their life investing in, they will wind up having a real positive impact, but that positive impact is a couple decades, 2 to 3 decades away. And that's coming out of that, I have a great deal of confidence. In the short term, I was very concerned about that transition. Well, we've just had about a half of the transition time we thought we had stripped away. So history, everything's on fast forward. All this stuff is now happening right now. So I think there's no choice. Governments are going to have to reach out and support their small, medium-sized businesses. I think companies, it's a bit of a reset in terms of what's the value system of a corporation. You know, how does it treat its employees and so on. If you're a young person and you're looking at this, it kind of goes back to the very first part of the conversation. If you simply expect things to be the way they were for your parents or your older brother who's 10 years older, older sister, don't, because it's not. And so I think that in that sense, you have a much more individual freedom to pursue different things. The technology to enable you to do that is going to be pretty significant. I think you're going to see a resurgence in trades, resurgence in plumbing, electricity, electronics, electricians, carpenters, etc. I think we've talked about that, but I think this is going to make it very, very real. We're already seeing in Montana, we're seeing a significant number of younger people going back and working on the land. It's never going to make you rich. You know, you're going to get paid $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. You're going to work like crazy, but you're going to be out in a beautiful place all the time. So I think this also accelerated the entire process of the next generation looking and saying, well, we don't necessarily want to be our parents, and we don't necessarily want to work this way. And I think there's a lot more choices that will come out of this, but this 1, 2, 3 year transition to that, it's going to be ugly.
You talked a little bit about people coming back home to work the land, and I know that you're working on some local resilience initiatives, and I think that's so important. It's such an important part of the new future. So can you talk a little bit about those two examples?
Right. So we fund through a foundation we set up. So we fund the mental health component is part of that. What you find in a lot of the more rural communities, especially in places like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and so on, is they're quite isolated. Social distancing is almost in the Constitution, out here. So it's not something that you have to work very hard to do. But with that, the real lack of support and the support groups for that. So what we're going to do is try to bolster that, because we think that's going to be a very, very big need as things go forward. Investing in local financing capabilities. So local venture funds that we've backed in Colorado, backed in Montana, some in Washington. Small folks that can work with the research institutions in these great firms, Montana State University, University of Washington, and so on. And so there's kind of seeding some of that entrepreneurial, ecosystem in these areas. You work with the government for the policies that say, all right, what do you actually need to have in the state of Montana or the state of Washington, state of Wyoming? What do you actually need to have in place to encourage young people to come here? So you have to have 5G. So you're going to have a very large investment in the technology infrastructure to support that. And that's way beyond our ability to influence. We to do, so we can influence it. We can't create that. That's something that the government's going to have to pay for. Mike Seifert, the new CEO of T-Mobile, I think has been very aggressive about saying, that's really their opportunity to become the dominant, the main carrier in the United States is what's happening on 5G, and I give them a decent shot at pulling that off. So all of those are initiatives that we're involved in kind of our local community. And then there's some more regional things when you start to think about how do you protect this? So I do a lot of conservation. So the Nature Conservancy Board, a group called PERC, that's a free market environmental group here, the Climate Leadership Council with Ted Halstead. So again, you kind of work at different levels. Some is very local, some is at the medium where you're still pretty hands-on, and then some's more at the policy level where you're just trying to get the ear of someone that can make a difference.
So are you generally positive for the future for your two kids? Because your two kids are young millennials, I think, by definition, right?
So we're spoiled. Okay.
Maybe not your two kids, but their friends, or maybe not their friends.
Generally speaking, I'm always an optimist. You can't do venture capital for 25 years and be a pessimist, right? Because otherwise you're just a miserable human being every day. So I'm always an optimist. But I think that the thing about this is the responsibility that the government has is to provide time for these kind of initiatives to work. If you look at one of the big tensions in US-China relations, it's always talking about unfair barriers to trade. Well, in Google being blocked or Facebook being blocked. Well, the reality is what they've done is I don't think they really made WeChat successful, but they actually bought time for their companies. And I think that that's something that governments around the world need to think about. That's what they can give their citizens. They can't give their citizens money. There's not enough of that. As much as we'd like to, there's not enough of that. You can give your citizens water. You can give your citizens healthcare. You can provide a place to live, etc. But fundamentally, what you can do is provide time, because everyone's going to need more time than they thought to work through the next several years.
So you can't give people money, so that means you don't believe in Andrew Yang's $10,000 per person, or whoever made that up. And universal basic health. What about income and health right now?
So healthcare, I actually think you should have some form of universal healthcare. I think that where people are stuck is when you have labor unions that have spent the last 30 years negotiating very extravagant healthcare programs for their members, and then you're going to tell them that you're going to give those away or get rid of them. That's kind of a non-starter. Or frankly, if you tell me, well, you're not allowed to have private healthcare, that's kind of a non-starter. So we're in the middle of that decision, and we'll see what comes out over the next administration, regardless of who's president. But I think there is a solution. I just don't think that you've come around to what that solution really needs to look like. What Andrew Yang's proposal was, I actually find that very interesting. We effectively do that now. You look at the social systems in the United States for people below the median income. When you add up all of the benefits that they're provided, it's actually quite a substantial amount of money. The problem is it's piecemeal, and it's all cut apart into hundreds of different pieces at the state level, local level, federal level. And what that does is that no one really gets a good picture of what it is we're spending and the effectiveness of that. So what we're going to have to do is use all the great data analytics tools and things that are coming out. We're going to have to learn to measure the effectiveness of the money coming from the government to people. And then I think we can make more intelligent decisions around this is what we should do. I think Andrew, I think Yang's onto a good point. I think the idea of a total universal basic income, 20, 30 years from now, I am pretty sure we'll be in that place. I'm pretty sure we'll be in that place.
So
but again,
how to check now for $10,000? I mean, this is the year that we need it.
Well, the U.S. government has effectively done that, Peggy. They've approved $4 trillion of expenditures so far. They're approving another $3 trillion tomorrow. So we're 40% of the U.S. economy in to disbursements to the population that dwarfs anything that Andrew Yang or anyone else would have thought about.
But has anybody actually gotten a check?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
No. That's one of the thousands. So they sent out 80 million checks. 79 million of those checks have been delivered. There was 1 million in which there were some issues, but less than 1% of the actual checks that were out had a problem. But no one ever talks about that. I mean, this administration, even when they do something right, they do it in such a way that you don't want to give them any credit. And so they don't, so they're their own worst enemy. But we've never, I mean, several things. You've never seen governments respond as quickly financially. I mean, Congress passed nearly unanimously, multi-trillion-dollar spending packages over the course of a couple of weeks. The vaccine cooperation, the approval through FDA, China's FDA, we've never seen anything like that before. So again, great collaboration, not as much coordination as would like to see at some of those levels. But I would predict in my lifetime, hopefully, because I hope to live another 20 something, 30 years, that we'll wind up seeing some form of universal basic income. But I think it'll be quite different than what Andrew was thinking about at the early stages of it.
Well, that's so much wisdom that I hope that you will share one day in a book. In a little one.
Lots of opinions. Lots of opinions.
But very wise opinions. And I think that if anybody has a chance to sit down with you and ask questions, they would be so lucky. So I mean, I'm so blessed to be able to ask you one-on-one questions. I think, I've been sort of saying, gosh, you should just run for office, but I know that's not for everybody.
No.
So,
if there's a dog catcher position in Belgrade, Montana, I might run for that. So.
Well, I think the Gary Rieschel program, if we can scale that and then involve more young people, I think that would be phenomenal.
What was really quite fun to see was when All In Seattle launched. They had a goal of about 15 million. They raised 30-something million dollars. Everyone participated. Pretty much everyone participated that they reached out to. And I'm hoping, Fortune wrote a nice piece about what happened in Seattle. And so what I'm hoping is we don't lose the good actions that have been made in the last 3 to 4 months, that when we're sitting here in the fall and we hopefully can take a deeper breath, that you look back and say, that worked, that didn't work, that worked. Hopefully we can really use some of this, but both generosity of spirit, but also the effort. We can actually do that going forward. And I think that's, if anything is going to come out of that, it's going to be the ability to say, we're going to make things better. We're not going to try to recreate things the way they were. And I think if we can do that, then I think the optimistic ranks will join. Well, the optimist ranks will be increased dramatically if we can pull that off.
Well, good. Thank you so much, Gary. I hope that there's more people who can grow up to be like you and be cultural bridges, who have the courage to be themselves and who think about collaboration and coordination. Is that right?
Yeah, you need both.
Love that. Love that. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Peggy. Always a pleasure.